we actually have a fair amount of time now for some discussion, and I don't see anybody immediately coming to the microphone. I just wanted to reflect as Deb was speaking. I had kind of an aha moment because when she was talking about the risk averseness and why our consent forms are the way they are, I think among the barriers that we have to doing effective clinical research in this country is not only the cost and some of the IRB challenges, but we also have clinicians who are not always highly motivated to enroll patients on trials. And part of that is the regulatory barriers just to get the trials open and so forth. But again, if you've got a 15 or 20 page consent form that has all of the institutional, what ifs in there, and it takes a huge time out of your practice to do that kind of thing, that also presents a barrier to even, the inertia to even present that to a patient who may in fact be very interested and very motivated to participate in a study. So I think all around responding to your concerns, I think would be very helpful to the research enterprise. Again, and this goes back to some of the incentives or disincentives that Jeff spoke about in his talk. So truly we do need a reset and to improve the efficiency of the whole clinical research enterprise. The other reflection that I had, again, I've been in practice for a long time, doing research for a long time, is there was a time when physicians were very paternalistic. Sometimes they were trusted wrongly and patients were engaged in unfortunate research experiences. But I think the issues that you raised with, particularly in oncology, where often the best treatment for a patient is a clinical trial, and this confusion that Dr. Jarvik also talked about is, what's clinical practice and what's research is sometimes an issue. And so in oncology, it's more true than almost any other kind of practice because of the issues of not having enough information about so many different kinds of conditions and the genetic tests that we now have to explore tumors. So this is going to get even more confusing for patients. And I think we would want to have every patient potentially be a research participant. And again, particularly when we have these rare mutations, and maybe there's a trial, maybe there isn't, but maybe there's a registry. We want to be able to capture that experience, and I think many patients would want their experience to be captured, if not for themselves, for other people who might benefit. So I think we need to figure out a more efficient way to meld these activities, to make them more seamless, to reduce the burden, but protect those who are participating in research. So those were just some reflections I had from the very excellent presentations that we just had.
Hi, Holly Taylor, Johns Hopkins. I wanted to, I have a question for Sharon, but I wanted to make a comment to the most recent speaker. As an academic, I'm a social scientist by training, I have struggled with this question of subject versus participant. I think you're right that it's an artifact at some level of the sort of traditional language that was used. My worry is that if we change the word from subject to participant without sort of changing the way some physicians view the participant, right, it sort of implies that there's a participation, that the subject is engaged. So I think it's a little of both, that I would, I think the transition is one that, needs to come from both sides, and the sort of engagement of, I consider you a participant, versus those who might still think, oh, you're just a subject. That I think that's an important shift.
I do too. So before your question, I think that it's a chicken or egg thing in a way. So when the word is there, what I hear all the time when I say, no, we need to use the word participant, and believe me, I do that in every setting, including NIH review panels. The comment is, oh, but it's in the regulations, so we need to use it. Okay, so, but that's why I said we need both. We need regulatory change, and we need the type of training and education that we talked about as well.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, right, I'd love for there to be a day when all subjects are actually participants. That would be terrific. And the question I had for Sharon, and you answered this a bit in your sort of additional comments, it wasn't clear to me who the customer is, and I apologize for using that term, and how I, as a potential participant in this, how am I told about who the potential, again, customer is in terms of the product that's being created?
So the guides help the community understand that. So the examples I can give are the sickle cell community and the FDA project. So the guides describe this is to give the FDA your opinion about risk and benefit because they're trying to do better at assessing risk and benefit in drug development. They describe then that the FDA will get the information and that there are other people listed, including yourself or sickle cell researchers that they really like, or all researchers, because it increases in terms of generality, that they also can share their information with. And some of the guides talk about other things, like we need more research done, and so we should be participating more on our own terms, which means we can decide who we want to participate with. Now, I have also had pushback that I am actually creating an enormous bias in this information, to which I respond that if we have 4% of individuals involved in clinical trials, we already have bias, and if I can get to 8%, that's pretty good. The other example is the breast cancer community and the coalition that's created the Free the Data platform using the same system, essentially is saying, first and foremost, your mutation will go to ClinVar. Then secondarily, you can also be offering your information to other customers. And I think the customer piece can be seen both ways. So on the recruit source side, which is where the researcher logs in, the customers can be the body of people, the cohort they put together to be part of a trial that they have an idea about a treatment for. And then on the patient side or the participant side, the customer could be a pharmaceutical company, it could be ClinVar, it could be a researcher in an academic institution.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I think this is clear from what you just said, but that all of this is transparent, that I have, as the member, I have the ability to say, I want to talk to that person, but I don't want to talk to that person, or I want to share my information with that pharmaceutical company, but not the NCI or something like that.
Exactly, and the idea is it's granular and dynamic, so you can make it as granular as you want, and you can change your mind according to context. And the other thing here too is people have worried that, well, people will be in there changing their mind every 2 seconds, and we're going to see all kinds of problems. Well, we've seen, studies of Amy McGuire. I think Ellen has some studies too that show people make a decision, and they're pretty comfortable with the decision if they've made it in a community context, and they stick with it. So we've found about 95% of individuals first accept the guide if they know the guide, or at least know the kind of guide, and that they don't go back and change. Now, do we eventually want people to be so engaged that they are changing? Sure. If they said, ask me for everything, and they're feeling pretty comfortable with the asks, we want them to go back in and say yes for lots of things. But again, we haven't found any of that to be a problem. And then the other question people ask us, and we only have 8,000 people in, so it's not hugely robust yet. But the other question people ask is, are most people sharing? The interesting thing is we cannot study the people who are not sharing because they won't give us their information, and we have to respect that. We can't even hack this. We've had a group try to hack it. But we do know that about 85% say yes, and another 10% say ask me, and then we are left with a small number that won't share anything. And then people say, well, why are they in there? Well, I think they're in there because they know someday they might want to, and at least they're all set.
Thank you.
Suanna?
Sure. Suanna Brunigi from the American Society of Clinical Oncology. I want to key off a little bit on what Patty was saying, because I think, I'm actually in the process of, doing a qualitative research project. So I've been looking over the IRB forums and trying to decide. I'm, just planning to interview clinicians and trying to decide, is it even worth submitting this to the IRB? Is it exempt? Is it expedited? And, a lot of these are they're difficult. Usually you have to call the IRB to get, really a clear answer, and then it's going to, vary based on their approach and their understanding of the situation. And, so we have this system set up, based on the level of risk, but sometimes it doesn't seem relevant to, the particular setting. And so I think that's why, your point about context is so important, Deb, because we often in the cancer world think of research being different because it's more integrated into the treatment setting, and we don't work with healthy volunteers. So, risks are different, especially if it's something that's added onto standard of care, where someone has risks anyway because of the toxicities involved in the drugs that we use. And of course, you have the other really big risk, which is you'll probably die from this disease if you don't seek some sort of treatment. So I guess part of me wonders, is it possible to think about this? Number one, are there other kinds of diseases where it's a similar situation where you've got patients that at the very least aren't being enrolled in placebo-controlled trials, are getting standard of care treatment, and the risk, for not enrolling on a trial is, we know to be definitively more higher. And I think, Patty's point about what we don't know is so voluminous. And the only way we are going to know this is by doing more research. And that, the off-label use of drugs is so high already in oncology. And the FDA approval in some cases, patients take that as, oh, that this is safe and effective. And we all know that that's not what FDA approval means. I mean, in terms of, we don't know it's going to be effective in your specific situation. And clinicians, are free to use drugs in different ways off-label in a clinical setting. So I'm just curious, especially, Sharon, since you work outside of cancer, is there perhaps a different way that can be thought about this, particularly with people facing life-threatening diseases?
So the same question is replete throughout the system, I think, in any life-threatening condition for which there's no clear treatment and there are some options that need to be tried. And, a classic example, I think, is progeria, Hutchinson-Gilford progeria. Sam Burns just died, the young man whose parents established that foundation. And Sam was in a clinical trial. There was no placebo arm. Every kid with progeria, all 60 of them in the world, were in the same trial. It didn't work. But they knew Sam should die at 13. He died at 17. So his life was at risk. I think for lots of rare life-threatening diseases, the same thing is happening that is happening in cancer. And then the other kind of disability of those diseases further is the clinical trial systems are not robust in other disease areas the way they are in cancer. So another good example is my children's disease, pseudoxanthoma elasticum. The only treatment for the eye is stuff they're borrowing off-label from macular degeneration. And they are trying 3 drugs now, and we're collecting all this data retrospectively because nobody will do a clinical trial for a whole host of political reasons and Genentech and lots of stuff. But there isn't a system set up either. These ophthalmologists can't just pick up a system that might be good infrastructure for this. So I think, yes, it's happening in other disease areas as well.
Deborah?
Yeah, and this doesn't necessarily address your point or your question, Susanna, but one thing that I think this brings up to me is that, in the cultural change that we need to make and the models that we need to create, I see the ACA as an opportunity to do so, because I think that where science is going with genomic information, where healthcare delivery is going, or has started at least in this process, we have the ability to put the pieces together in very different ways than have been there before, including regulations. So, and I hope that would create a model for other diseases perhaps as well. And I think cancer is in better shape in some ways than others, which is really scary. I've gotten involved with antibacterial resistance in the last several years, and oh my gosh, cancer looks good.
I just wanted to, before calling on Jeff, I just wanted to comment on Holly's comment about the participant not necessarily being an active participant. If you look at our recent IOM consensus study on delivering high-quality cancer care, the patient is at the center of our framework. Patient engagement is at the center of our framework. A well-informed patient whose values and preferences are evaluated. And when you do not have a standard care that is effective, or there may be something more promising, or we have a genomic test, you could see how you could just transparently move into a clinical trial as part of that patient engagement. So I think, again, to your discussion point about the ACA and how we build a better quality cancer care delivery system, these clinical trials need to be just part of the seamless care that we deliver, and eliminating some of the regulatory burdens, consent forms, all these other things, and making this part of high quality care, which we do recommend, is just the next step. So making that patient engaged for adherence purposes, whether it's standard treatment or following up on a trial, I think are just part of this whole conceptual framework. So I just wanted to echo what was said.
Jeff Botkin, University of Utah. This is a question for Deborah. I wanted to hear about what your hopes or expectations are out of the sort of changes you've been calling for. And I think the changes or improvements in the informed consent process, of course, are different than reducing the regulatory burden. It may well be that improvements in the consent process require more regulatory burden. You know, and I've been asked by a reporter about my interest in the SACHARP connection with the consent process, and the question was, so is the point to increase enrollment in research? And I had to answer, no, that's not the point. You know, at least with the bioethics hat on, I'm comfortable saying the point is to improve the quality of that process, even at some risk that it will decrease recruitment. But I don't know whether your perspective is the same. Is it okay to reduce recruitment if the process is improved?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And what's interesting about it is that so often those of us that have been involved in research, especially clinical research, once investigators decide that it's okay for us to be involved, the first thing they want to do is have us help them with accrual. And the point that we make then is, well, you know, it's great, we'll be involved. We want to be involved in the study design, in the whole approach that's being taken, because we can be much more effective in creating trials that will be more interesting to people, who then may increase accrual for that reason. But that's not the goal that we have. The goal is to create better information that someone can actually use to make a decision that's right for them. It may sound nebulous, but that's actually, I think, the motivation for many of us in the area. I don't know if that helps.
Terrence?
Terry Albrecht, Wayne State University and Karmanos Cancer Institute. And again, I echo the statements of others. This was a great panel, and I'm very thankful that you will be the last, your voices will be the ones that will be heard as we move on into the evening. The recency effect is a very important one for discussions like this. My question is a little off center in terms of where the discussion has been going. One of the questions that we started with back in the early 1990s was the question: why isn't every patient who walks through the doors of an NCI-designated comprehensive cancer center enrolled on a protocol to the extent they are eligible for one that is available? And, you know, at the time I thought, well, you know, it had to be because we didn't have that many protocols. There wasn't as much research going on as we might think. And certainly over the years that has increased. But we're still asking the question. And of course it gets to the holy grail of accrual and what we want to see happen. And it's certainly a criterion by which cancer centers are evaluated and so on. And it is the way we hope to find the cause and cure of cancer. But I think the other issue though that we're dealing with, and I was surprised didn't come up today, was the idea that in some institutions there are trials that are available that patients who walk through those doors are eligible for. And for reasons, for a myriad of reasons, those trials are not offered to those patients. And one of the places where we've observed this in the studies that we've done in different institutions is, for example, a low-income minority patient who is has a fairly low income and lower education, and the comment that is made is this person won't understand the consent form, won't understand what's going to happen, isn't going to be able to adhere. Doesn't have a clue is the phrase that we hear. We also hear that if the patient shows up at 5 o'clock, it's going to take too long to inform this patient the way we need to. And so that the patient is not, it's much easier to go ahead and offer the standard of care and leave it at that. A number of these kinds of things. It's one of those things we don't like to talk about in a civil company, but the fact is that we see it, and we also see it as a factor that plays into health disparities, and a real disparity in terms of access to trials. And we haven't talked about that today. I wonder if the panel has any insights or any thoughts about that.
So we're in conversation with a number of community-based hospitals, because we think that, again, the academic medical centers, while there's lots and lots of problems we could talk about all day long, if 86% of Americans get their care, and many of the people in underserved communities do in community-based hospitals, then we need to be there. And the conversations that we've been having with them are having the, in this case, a tablet version of what we offer be part of the culture of the waiting room, so that the person is giving family history. There's decision-making tools built in so that the physician is helped, so he's incentivized to want it or she, and that they're being offered whatever trial matches them being there. That takes a shift. It also takes an institutional commitment, and we've seen both actually some major medical centers as well as some community hospitals that are very interested in, and we're meeting with them to see how do we integrate this so that it is part of just the culture of the organization, the community, to say we will always be enrolling people. This will be our way to talk to them, to engage them, to be with them, and they'll be hearing from their peers why this is good to do. Once the system itself is set up, it's pretty easy, and we've had some really good successes in sickle cell clinics already while people are undergoing infusion, et cetera, to be enrolled in trials or to be giving their opinion, and we think it will work pretty much the same in other institutions.
I just want to say that to the person that where you hear, this guy doesn't have a clue, it is that institution's, that PI's responsibility ethically, professionally, and as a human being to help them understand. I don't care if it's 5 o'clock. I mean, and I think, I think the majority of people would go ahead and do that, but you have exceptions as well.
Well, we know that there's a lot of filtering that goes on before the discussions, and I think that's your point, Terry. As far as disparities, the way, and I've been involved in a lot of those discussions as well, all patients have issues and problems, but there are so many that are unproportional and are caused by equity issues, by discrimination, by race, ethnicity, cultural, all of those types of things. And when I talk about generally that communication is one of the C words that we need to focus on, I'm meaning all of that. So I'm sorry if I didn't make that point. And you did bring up disparities, but I think you may have been one of the only speakers that did. So it's a major issue. It's beyond the clinical trial research discussion and regulatory discussion that we've had here, but it should be endemic throughout, I think, any of the changes that we're talking about making. We have to include that as a piece of the whole pie.
John?
John Mendelson from MD Anderson Cancer Center. First, I want to thank the panelists not only for participating today, but for the hundreds of hours you put in year-round advocating for patients in the areas we've been discussing today. The aha moment for me this day was when someone asked the question, is there an example of someone abusing information that became public, and an example couldn't be given? Now, this may be because of the rigorous way in which we have controlled and regulated clinical research to protect patients from risk. But as I said at the beginning of the morning, it's a balance between risk and benefit that I think we have to look at. And patients that are put on experimental cancer therapies, even though, as was pointed out by one of the speakers, are at a low point and a very vulnerable point, are truly willing to accept risk in order to get at new therapies. So my question is, are we, in this balance, are we too excessively protecting risk today? And is that why our consent forms are 30 and 40 pages and there's so much bureaucracy? And if you agree with that, if you agree it needs a rebalancing, in my opinion, patient advocacy groups are in the strongest position to get this readjusted. Doctors are looked at as self-serving. We want to do the research. We get promoted. We're getting funds from the drug companies, from the government. You are in the unique position to rebalance this risk-benefit ratio if you believe that we've tipped a little too far, in my opinion. I'd love to hear your comments.
Yeah, so that's why Genetic Alliance jumped on this patient-focused drug development initiative with FDA. And the idea, of course, is that we expect we're going to hear, and we did hear, for example, in the sickle cell hearing last week, that we've gone way too far trying to protect people, and so people are suffering as a result of us trying to protect them. And there's lots of considerations around these are underserved communities to the most part, et cetera. But these people said, I'm suffering and you're protecting me from things I don't need to be protected from. I really need to have the solutions. I think we see lots of other communities, particularly in cancer. You know, my father and my brother both died from cancer, and as they were dying from glioblastoma and colon cancer, they both wondered that if we had been allowed to try some stuff and pay attention to the trying, would we be farther than we were today, and would we spare somebody else who's coming along? So I think you're right, and I think that we, the advocacy communities, can make a difference when we work together, and lots of us do, and I think that that's very effective, because I think trying to, and I think there's two kinds of risks. There are true, genuine people who are trying to protect individuals from risk in the drug development or the treatment development process. I think there's also a lot of what Deborah and Laura both have talked about, and that is looking at the institution's risk, and the long forms start to be part of a litigious culture, et cetera, and they're protecting the institution's risk. So I think both of those things need to be blown up, and it's going to be tough. As I said, I think biomedical research is a regulated cottage industry, and that makes for lots and lots of problems we don't see in other things like aviation, for example.
Yes, I would agree. As a clinical trial participant at your fine institution, yeah, it is about CYA a lot of times, and it's unfortunate.
I think, I mean, for years, a lot of us, and Patty brought this up actually, have talked about having a registry, kind of longitudinal outcome kind of registry or whatever we want to call it, that could be presented to every patient that walks through the door. And if that were the case, I think that that could change the whole aspect and the whole approach that we take to clinical research. Some people would be eligible for a study they may or may not know about now. We would talk to them about it in a much different way. Their role, how that trial would fit into their life story could be very different. So can we help with that? Absolutely. But again, we have to change the context and the communication that we use with patients. And uncertainty is really the issue. It's the issue for patients, it's the issue for the investigators, it's the issue for the institutions. We need to just start dealing with that fact and then work through a program. I mean, so I think the registry is a part of that. I would love to see a group like IOM or whatever else other group we could do, have one of these kind of workshops, lock the doors, and make everybody stay there until we actually put a plan together that we can then test in many ways. And so I would hope that we don't have another meeting like this, that it comes up with a lot of really good discussions about the whole thing, but we actually have a workshop that develops the program that we're going to test.
I like your idea. It would be important for many of the issues our country's addressing, not just this. But getting back to my question then, and thank you for your comments. One of the main focal points is the IRB. And academicians and universities are not allowed to tamper with the IRB for good reasons. There's one group that could influence IRBs. Patient advocacy groups could address things and give the IRBs, shall I use the word, the courage to accept more risk, which maybe innately they want to do, but they're being advised by lawyers and lots of other people, and we're covering, as you pointed out, so carefully that I think we're making this very complicated, and the clinical investigators are getting very frustrated of what they have to go, over what they have to go through, and your advice to IRBs would be incredibly important if you believe that the patients need and want a little more risk in order to get at these trials.
And we've definitely gone there and had conversations and gone to the professional societies, and what they say is they need data. So that's why we're doing the project we're doing right now, is to say, okay, the stories I can tell you are, and these guys, many more than I probably, are amazing, but they're not data. And so the data points are going to be the convincing piece, we hope.
Anyone else in the room have a question? Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to invite everyone up to the third floor where we have a nice reception. And thank you all for attending today, and hopefully you'll come back tomorrow when we have breakfast at 8 o'clock and start our session 5 with some excellent speakers at 8:30, okay? And have a good evening.